Snow had been falling since early evening, quietly, without urgency. The town was already asleep, wrapped in white and silence. Only one building still had its lights on, and one man was still awake, walking slowly through the night. The snowstorm did not arrive suddenly. It had been expected all day, spoken about in low voices at the diner, mentioned briefly on the radio, dismissed by people who were already used to winters like this. By the time night came, the snow had settled into a steady rhythm, falling without wind, without sound loud enough to disturb anything that was already quiet. The night watchman arrived at the factory 10 minutes early, as he always did. He parked his old car in the same spot near the back fence, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment before getting out. Snowflakes landed softly on the windshield and melted into thin lines of water that slid downward and disappeared. He opened the door slowly, letting the cold air fill the car one last time before stepping out. His boots pressed into fresh snow, leaving clear footprints that would be gone by morning. The factory stood tall and dark, its brick walls dusted white, its windows glowing faintly from the inside. It had not been fully operational for years, but it still needed watching. Empty buildings, people said, attracted problems. He reached the side entrance, brushed snow from his coat, and unlocked the door. The sound of the lock clicking open echoed slightly in the empty space behind it. Inside, the air was warmer, but still carried the smell of old metal, dust, and something faint. The clock above the office door marked time without sound, its thin hands moving so slowly they were almost impossible to notice. The watchman passed beneath it without looking up, already aware of the hour by the feel of the night. Snowstorms had a way of stretching time, making minutes feel longer and quieter than usual. He walked through a narrow corridor that connected the main floor to the storage wing. The lights here were dimmer, spaced farther apart. Shadows pooled between them, resting comfortably in the corners. His flashlight stayed pointed toward the floor, illuminating only what was necessary. He had learned long ago that there was no need to rush a night like this. At the end of the corridor, he stopped and listened again. The building responded the same way it always did, with nothing. The heating system sighed softly somewhere behind the walls, a steady breath that reminded him the place was still alive in its own slow way. He opened a metal door leading to a stairwell and climbed upward, one step at a time. His hand rested lightly on the railing, cold under his glove. The upper level held old offices, most of them empty except for desks and cabinets that had not been opened in years. He checked them anyway. Routine mattered more than necessity. One office window faced north, looking out toward a stretch of land that had once been a parking lot. Now it was just white. Snow covered everything evenly, erasing lines and shapes. He stood there for a while, watching the snow fall diagonally now as the wind picked up slightly. It brushed against the glass in soft taps, like fingertips testing a surface. He moved on, locking and relocking doors that were already secure. Each click of a lock felt like punctuation in a sentence that never really ended. When he returned downstairs, he made a note in the logbook. The pen scratched quietly against the paper. "All clear," he wrote, just as he had written countless times before. The words meant less than the act of writing them. He sat again at the desk, adjusting the lamp so the light fell directly on the open pages of the log. The rest of the room faded into darkness. He poured another small cup of coffee, though it had already begun to lose its warmth. Outside, the snow had thickened, the flakes larger now, drifting more slowly, as if growing tired. He thought about how the factory must look from above, its flat roof collecting snow layer by layer, the edges growing heavier. By morning, it would appear almost gentle, softened into something quiet and harmless. The radio remained silent. He was glad for that. After some time, he stood once more and resumed his walk, this time circling the perimeter of the main floor. His boots traced familiar paths, and he barely noticed the distance. In one corner, a pipe ticked faintly as hot water moved through it. The sound was irregular, but not alarming. He paused anyway, listening until the rhythm settled again. Snowstorms had always made him more attentive, even when there was nothing to attend to. The stillness sharpened small details, the way light reflected off metal, the way shadows shifted when he moved. At another window, he saw his own reflection faintly layered over the snow outside, just a shape, indistinct. He did not study it for long. He preferred the view beyond the glass, where everything was simple and slow. Hours passed in this manner, marked only by repeated movements and small pauses. He checked the doors again. He walked the same corridors again. Nothing changed, and that was exactly how it should be. Sometime after midnight, the power flickered, just once. The lights dimmed, then returned to full strength. He stopped where he was, waited, and listened. The heating system resumed its steady hum. The silence closed back in around him. He wrote another note in the logbook, brief and factual, no need for more. Outside, the wind had begun to ease. Snow still fell, but more gently now, settling rather than swirling. The watchman noticed this through the high windows near the ceiling, where the glass had frosted slightly along the edges. He took his time during the next round, moving even slower than before. There was no reason to hurry. The night was long, and the morning was still far away. In the back section of the building, he paused near a large roll-up door that had not been opened in years. He placed his hand against it, feeling the cold seep through the glove. On the other side was nothing but snow and darkness. He stood there for a while, breathing evenly, letting the quiet settle into him. Nights like this did not ask for anything. They only needed to be passed through. Eventually, he turned away and made his way back toward the desk. The chair creaked again as he sat. He leaned back slightly, resting his hands on his thighs, eyes open but unfocused. The snowstorm continued its patient work outside, covering the world inch by inch. Inside the factory, time moved just as slowly, guided by footsteps, locks, and the soft ticking of a clock that no one ever watched. The watchman remained awake, present, and calm, carrying the night forward without disturbance.
He stood again, lifting the flashlight from the desk, though its beam would add very little to the already lit corridors. Habit guided the motion more than need. He adjusted his jacket at the shoulders, felt the familiar weight of it settle, and stepped away from the desk, leaving the small island of light behind him. The hallway welcomed him back with the same quiet patience it always had. His footsteps sounded softer now, muffled slightly, as if the building itself had absorbed more silence while he sat. He walked at an even pace, neither slow nor fast, letting each step land fully before taking the next. Near the center of the factory floor, he paused beside a support column and looked upward. The ceiling disappeared into shadow, the lights spaced far apart, their glow diffused by dust and age. Somewhere above, snow continued to gather on the roof, pressing down gently, evenly, without urgency. He imagined the sound it might make up there, soft, dull, constant, but nothing reached him through the thick structure. He resumed walking, turning toward a corridor that led to a series of smaller rooms once used for record storage. The doors here were narrower, their paint chipped at the edges. He opened each one carefully, letting the light spill in before stepping inside. The rooms were empty except for shelves and a faint smell of old paper. He did not linger. He closed the doors again, ensuring each latch settled into place with a quiet click. At the end of the corridor, a small window sat just above eye level. He stood beneath it and looked out. Snow pressed against the glass now, clinging in uneven patches. Beyond it, the night felt closer, heavier, but still calm. No movement, no sound, just the suggestion of a world continuing quietly without him. He stayed there longer than necessary, breathing slowly, feeling the warmth of the building contrast with the imagined cold outside. Eventually, he turned away and retraced his steps, his reflection briefly appearing in the dark glass of the doors as he passed. Back on the main floor, he checked his watch. Time had moved forward, though it felt unchanged. He nodded once, as if acknowledging an agreement between himself and the night, and continued on his route. Near one of the older machines, he stopped again. The tarp covering it had shifted slightly, likely from the circulating air. He smoothed it back into place with a gloved hand. The fabric felt rough, stiff from age. When he stepped away, the machine returned to its formless stillness. The heating system exhaled softly through a vent overhead. He listened to the sound until it blended back into the background, indistinguishable from the rest of the quiet. Another round completed, he returned to the desk and sat. He did not pour more coffee this time. Instead, he rested his hands on the surface of the desk and stared at the open logbook without writing. The pages were filled with similar nights, similar notes, similar confirmations that nothing had happened. Outside, the snow had begun to fall more slowly, each flake larger, heavier, more deliberate. He watched them through the window beside the desk, their downward paths unhurried, almost thoughtful. They landed and disappeared into the white below, contributing to something larger without drawing attention to themselves. He leaned back in the chair, careful not to let it creak again, and closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, just to rest them. The darkness behind his eyelids felt no different from the shadows in the building. When he opened them again, nothing had changed. He stood once more, stretching his shoulders slightly, and began another walk. This time, he followed the outer wall of the factory, where the windows were spaced far apart and set higher. The light from inside barely reached them, but the snow outside reflected enough glow to make the glass faintly visible. At one window, he wiped away a small circle of condensation with his sleeve and looked out. The fence line was nearly invisible now, buried under snow. The road beyond it was indistinct, blending into the field. The world seemed reduced to only a few simple elements: snow, darkness, and silence. He moved on, stopping occasionally to check locks that did not need checking. His hands performed the motions automatically, without thought. Lock, press, release, move on. In the far corner of the building, he stood near a closed loading door and listened again. The storm had quieted further. Even the faint wind from earlier was gone. The night felt deeper now, heavier in its stillness. He remained there unmoving for a long time. His breath formed a slow, steady rhythm. The building responded with nothing at all. Eventually, he turned back toward the desk, his footsteps marking a gentle path through the silence. The lamp still glowed where he had left it, unchanged. He sat down, opened the logbook, and added a short line. The pen moved smoothly. He closed the book when he was finished. Time continued its gradual movement. The clock's hands advanced without sound. He stayed seated for a while, watching the snow, listening to the hum of the building, letting the night pass through him rather than around him. There was no need to anticipate the morning. It would arrive on its own. When he stood again, it was simply because the routine required it. He picked up the flashlight and stepped away from the desk, returning to the corridors that waited patiently for his return. The snowstorm persisted outside, quieter now, but no less steady, and the watchman continued his work, carrying the calm forward, one measured step at a time. He remained standing beside the desk for a few moments longer, not waiting for anything in particular, simply allowing the stillness to settle again. The lamp's light did not flicker. The room held its shape. When he finally moved, it was with the same measured intention as before. He lifted the flashlight, though the beam stayed off for now, and stepped away from the desk. His boots made the same muted sound against the floor, a soft confirmation that he was moving through familiar space. The corridors accepted him without change. As he walked, he noticed the faint warmth rising from the floor in certain areas, carried by pipes beneath the concrete. It was subtle, uneven, but consistent enough to be recognizable. He slowed slightly, letting his steps match the quiet rhythm of the building. Near the maintenance rooms, he paused again. The doors here were heavier, reinforced, their handles worn smooth from years of use. He checked each one carefully, pulling once, then pressing gently. Secure, secure, secure. The sequence repeated without variation. He turned down a short hallway that ended in a blank wall, the kind of space people often forgot existed. A single light buzzed faintly overhead. He stood beneath it, letting the sound fade into the background, and then turned around, retracing his steps without haste. The snow outside continued to fall, though he could no longer hear it. He could only see its presence through the windows, the way it pressed against the glass, the way it softened the edges of everything beyond. It gave the night a closed feeling, as if the world had been wrapped carefully and left to rest. He passed by the covered machines again, their forms unchanged. The tarps lay still now, undisturbed. He did not adjust them this time. There was no need. At the far end of the main floor, he reached a narrow door that led to a small office, used only for storage now. He unlocked it, stepped inside, and turned on the light. The room was simple: a desk, a filing cabinet, a chair pushed neatly beneath it. Dust rested evenly across the surfaces, undisturbed. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then turned off the light and closed the door again. The lock clicked softly. He pocketed the key and moved on. His route brought him back toward the windows along the east wall. The glow outside had shifted slightly, not brighter, just different. Snowflakes moved more slowly now, drifting almost straight down. He stopped at one window and watched them fall, his breathing matching their pace without effort. He thought briefly of how the town would look by morning, streets narrowed by snowbanks, roofs carrying their white weight. He did not picture people, just the quiet shapes of buildings and roads, waiting. He stepped away from the window and continued walking. The heating system adjusted again, a low murmur passing through the vents. He paused instinctively, listening until it settled. When it did, the silence returned, unbroken. He completed another full circuit and returned to the desk. This time he sat, pulling the chair in carefully. He opened the logbook, but did not write. Instead, he let his hand rest on the page, feeling the texture of the paper beneath his glove. After a moment, he closed the book again. He leaned back slightly, eyes open, unfocused. The lamp cast soft shadows that did not move. The clock continued its silent progress. After a while, he stood once more. The movement felt natural, expected. He picked up the flashlight and turned it on this time, the beam low and steady, illuminating the floor ahead. He walked toward the stairwell door again. The draft he had noticed earlier was gone now. The air felt consistent, still. He opened the door just enough to look down the stairs. The bulb glowed as before, unchanged. He closed the door and locked it, testing it once more before moving on. He followed the outer wall again, his flashlight tracing a slow path along the base of the wall, the corners, the seams where floor met concrete. Nothing interrupted the beam, nothing waited in the shadows. At one point, he stopped near a support column and rested his hand against it. The surface was cool and solid. He stood there, unmoving, letting the quiet press gently around him. The building felt steady, patient. He resumed walking, completing another round without incident. When he returned to the desk, he checked his watch again. Time had advanced, though the night felt unchanged. He acknowledged it with a small nod and moved on. The snowstorm outside continued its steady work. The windows showed less contrast now, the outside world reduced to variations of white and gray. The factory's interior felt warmer by comparison, enclosed and contained. He walked past the utility panel again, glancing at the lights. Still steady, still green. He moved on without touching it this time. In the storage wing, he walked between rows of empty shelving. His flashlight moved slowly from one end to the other, illuminating dust and nothing else. He did not hurry. He let the beam linger where it wanted. When he reached the end of the row, he turned and walked back the same way, footsteps quiet, even. The repetition was comforting. He paused once more at a window, wiping away condensation again. The snow had reached higher now, nearly covering the lower edge of the glass. He watched as a flake landed and slid slowly downward before disappearing. He stepped back, letting the condensation return, and continued on. The radio remained silent, the desk lamp remained steady, the clock continued its unseen movement. He completed another round and returned to the desk. This time he stood beside it instead of sitting. He placed the flashlight down gently and rested both hands on the surface, looking out the window once more. The night felt deep now, settled into itself. There was no sense of anticipation, no edge to the quiet, just a steady continuation. After a moment, he picked up the flashlight again and stepped away, returning to the corridors that stretched ahead of him, unchanged and waiting. The snowstorm persisted outside, calm and unhurried. Inside, the watchman continued his steady movement, carrying the night forward without interruption, one measured step following the next. He moved back into the corridor without changing his pace, the flashlight angled downward, its beam resting lightly on the floor a few steps ahead. The building felt unchanged, as if it had been waiting in exactly the same position while he sat. The walls held their quiet. The air remained steady and warm. As he walked, he noticed the faint outline of his earlier footprints near one of the side entrances, where melted snow had been tracked in long before his shift began. They were nearly dry now, barely visible. He followed them for a few steps, then let them fade behind him. He turned into a wider section of the factory floor, where the ceiling rose higher and the space opened outward. The lights here cast longer shadows, stretching them thin across the concrete. His own shadow moved with him, steady and unremarkable, attached but not demanding attention. He slowed near a utility panel mounted on the wall and checked the small indicator lights. All steady, all green. He rested his hand briefly against the metal casing, feeling a slight vibration beneath the surface. Satisfied, he stepped away. The snow outside continued to fall with deliberate patience. Through a distant window, he could see it piling against the base of the building, smoothing over edges and seams. The world beyond the walls seemed smaller now, simplified by white and darkness. He reached a set of double doors that led to a secondary storage area and unlocked them with a quiet turn of the key. The hinges made a soft sound as he opened them just enough to look inside. The room was larger than the others, mostly empty,
with the faint smell of cardboard and wood. He stepped in, sweeping the flashlight slowly across the floor, the walls, the ceiling. Nothing moved, nothing waited. He closed the doors again and locked them carefully, ensuring the latch settled fully. The sound echoed faintly, then disappeared. He continued along the perimeter, his boots marking a gentle rhythm against the concrete. Each step landed evenly, neither hurried nor hesitant. He had learned long ago that the night responded best to consistency. At a corner window, he paused again. Snow had nearly covered the lower half of the glass now, pressed against it from outside. He leaned closer, resting his forehead lightly against the cool surface for a moment, not because he needed to see better, but because the cold felt grounding. He straightened again and moved on. The heating system adjusted itself with a low murmur, then returned to its steady hum. The sound blended seamlessly into the background, undistinguishable from the quiet once it settled. He completed another full circuit of the floor and returned to the desk. This time he poured a small amount of coffee, more out of habit than desire. The liquid was lukewarm now. He drank it slowly anyway, letting each sip linger before swallowing. He set the cup aside and stood, stretching his fingers, rotating his shoulders gently. The motion was slow and deliberate, careful not to introduce anything abrupt into the night. When he felt the stiffness ease slightly, he picked up the flashlight again and resumed his walk. In one of the narrower corridors, he noticed a faint draft near the floor. It was subtle, barely perceptible. He followed it to a door leading to a stairwell that descended into a lower maintenance area. He opened it just enough to look down. The stairwell was empty, lit by a single bulb halfway down. The air felt colder there, heavier. He closed the door and locked it, making a mental note to check it again later. As he walked away, the draft faded back into the building's general stillness. He moved toward the far end of the factory, where a long row of windows faced east. The snow outside reflected the interior lights faintly, creating a dull glow that softened the darkness beyond. He walked past each window, glancing out without stopping, letting the repetition lull his attention into a gentle rhythm. At the last window, he paused and stood still. The storm had changed again. The flakes were smaller now, falling straighter, with less drift. The sky above was a uniform gray, neither light nor dark. Somewhere far beyond the fence, the world continued, unseen and unheard. He remained there, breathing slowly, counting nothing, waiting for nothing. Eventually, he turned back and began retracing his steps. The factory accepted his return without reaction. Doors stayed closed, machines stayed silent. The night remained intact. When he reached the center of the building again, he checked his watch. Only a small amount of time had passed, though it felt more. He nodded slightly and continued. He passed the covered machines once more, their shapes unchanged. He adjusted one tarp that had loosened again, smoothing it down with care. The fabric whispered softly under his hand, then fell quiet. The desk came back into view, the lamp still casting its circle of light. He sat, opened the logbook, and added another short entry. The handwriting was steady, unhurried. He closed the book and set the pen beside it. He did not sit back this time. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk, looking at the window. Snow continued to gather there, the outside world becoming increasingly abstract. The radio crackled briefly, just a burst of static, then went silent again. He did not reach for it. There was nothing to respond to. After a moment, he stood and resumed his rounds. The movement felt familiar, almost automatic. His body knew what to do without instruction. In the back section of the building, he walked more slowly, listening carefully. The snowstorm had dampened all external sound. Even distant traffic was gone. The factory existed in its own enclosed quiet, separate from the rest of the night. He stopped near a support beam and leaned against it lightly, feeling the solid presence of the structure beneath his hand. It had been standing here for decades, enduring countless winters. This one was no different. He straightened and moved on. The hours stretched gently, without markers, no alarms, no interruptions, just repeated motion and stillness layered over one another. At another window, he paused again. Snow had nearly covered the lower half of the glass now, pressed against it from outside. He leaned closer, resting his forehead lightly against the cool surface for a moment, not because he needed to see better, but because the cold felt grounding. He straightened again and moved on. The heating system adjusted itself with a low murmur, then returned to its steady hum. The sound blended seamlessly into the background, undistinguishable from the quiet once it settled. He completed another full circuit of the floor and returned to the desk. This time he poured a small amount of coffee, more out of habit than desire. The liquid was lukewarm now. He drank it slowly anyway, letting each sip linger before swallowing. He set the cup aside and stood, stretching his fingers, rotating his shoulders gently. The motion was slow and deliberate, careful not to introduce anything abrupt into the night. When he felt the stiffness ease slightly, he picked up the flashlight again and resumed his walk. In one of the narrower corridors, he noticed a faint draft near the floor. It was subtle, barely perceptible. He followed it to a door leading to a stairwell that descended into a lower maintenance area. He opened it just enough to look down. The stairwell was empty, lit by a single bulb halfway down. The air felt colder there, heavier. He closed the door and locked it, making a mental note to check it again later. As he walked away, the draft faded back into the building's general stillness. He moved toward the far end of the factory, where a long row of windows faced east. The snow outside reflected the interior lights faintly, creating a dull glow that softened the darkness beyond. He walked past each window, glancing out without stopping, letting the repetition lull his attention into a gentle rhythm. At the last window, he paused and stood still. The storm had changed again. The flakes were smaller now, falling straighter, with less drift. The sky above was a uniform gray, neither light nor dark. Somewhere far beyond the fence, the world continued, unseen and unheard. He remained there, breathing slowly, counting nothing, waiting for nothing. Eventually, he turned back and began retracing his steps. The factory accepted his return without reaction. Doors stayed closed, machines stayed silent. The night remained intact. When he reached the center of the building again, he checked his watch. Only a small amount of time had passed, though it felt more. He nodded slightly and continued.
He moved down the corridor at the same unbroken pace, the flashlight now switched off again, resting loosely in his hand. The lights overhead were sufficient, and the darkness beyond them did not press forward. It stayed where it belonged, settled and quiet. The floor felt slightly warmer here, the heat beneath it more noticeable. He adjusted his steps unconsciously, letting his weight distribute evenly as he walked. The sensation reminded him that the building was still working in small ways, even while everything else remained still. He reached a junction where 3 corridors met and paused, not because he needed to decide which way to go, but because this was one of the places where he always paused. He listened. Nothing responded. The sound of his own breathing seemed too loud for a moment, then faded back into the general hush. He turned left and continued, passing a row of narrow windows set high in the wall. They were opaque now with frost and snow, admitting only a dull, colorless glow. He did not try to see through them.
He already knew what was there. At the end of the corridor, he checked a fire exit door, pressing against it gently, then checking the handle. Secure. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary, hand still resting on the cold metal, before stepping away. He retraced his steps and turned into another corridor, this one leading toward an older section of the factory, where the floor dipped slightly. His boots adjusted to the change automatically. The walls here were rougher, the paint worn thinner. He ran the flashlight briefly along one wall, not to inspect it closely, but out of habit. The beam revealed nothing new. As he walked, he became aware again of the snow pressing against the building from the outside. He could not hear it, but he felt its presence in the way the world beyond the walls seemed sealed off. The factory felt like a contained space, separate from whatever lay beyond the white. He stopped near a closed office door and rested his forehead lightly against the wood, just for a moment. The door was cool, solid. He straightened again and continued walking without thinking further about it. The heating system cycled once more, a gentle shift in pressure that moved through the vents like a sigh. He paused instinctively, waiting for it to settle. When it did, the silence returned, complete and unbroken. He passed through the main floor again, the covered machines forming familiar shapes along his path. The tarps lay flat now, unmoving. He did not touch them. There was no reason to. At the far end of the floor, he reached a small break area that had once been used more frequently. A table sat against the wall, its surface bare. A vending machine stood dark and silent in the corner, unplugged long ago. He glanced at it briefly and moved on. His route brought him back toward the desk, but he did not stop there yet. Instead, he turned into the storage wing again, walking slowly between empty shelves. Dust rested undisturbed on every surface. The flashlight remained off. He did not need it. He reached the end of the aisle and stopped. The quiet felt thicker here, more enclosed. He stood still, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes open and unfocused. His breathing remained steady. The moment passed without change. He turned and walked back the way he had come, his footsteps marking the same gentle rhythm as before. Nothing shifted, nothing followed. When he returned to the main floor, he checked his watch again. Time continued its steady movement. He acknowledged it with a small adjustment of his posture and continued on. He walked toward the stairwell once more. The door was cool under his hand. He opened it slightly and looked down. The light below remained unchanged, the steps empty. He closed the door and locked it, pressing once more to be certain. Satisfied, he moved away. The snow outside continued to fall, though more slowly now. Through one of the lower windows, he could see where it had piled up against the building, creating a soft, uneven slope. He watched it for a moment, then turned away. He completed another circuit and finally returned to the desk. This time he sat. The chair made only the faintest sound as he lowered himself into it. He rested his hands on his knees and looked at the window beside the desk. The outside world appeared almost flat now, stripped of depth by snow and darkness. The flakes fell steadily, each one following its own quiet path downward. He did not count them, he simply watched. After a while, he reached for the thermos and poured the last of the coffee into his cup. It was nearly cold now. He drank it slowly anyway, letting the familiar taste linger. When the cup was empty, he set it aside and did not refill it. He opened the logbook and wrote another short entry. The pen moved smoothly. He closed the book and slid it back into its place. He sat quietly for a time, eyes drifting from the window to the room and back again. The lamp's light remained steady. The radio remained silent. The clock continued its quiet work. Eventually, he stood again. The movement felt neither early nor late. It was simply the next thing to do. He picked up the flashlight and stepped away from the desk, returning to the corridors once more. The air felt slightly different now, cooler near the floor, warmer near the ceiling. He adjusted his pace unconsciously, letting his body respond without thought. He walked past the utility panel again and glanced at the lights. Still steady, still unchanged. He moved on. In the far corner of the building, he stopped near a window and wiped away condensation once more. The snow outside had reached nearly halfway up the glass. He watched as a small clump slid downward, breaking apart as it fell. He stepped back and allowed the condensation to return again, softening the view. The window became a pale, indistinct surface, reflecting only faint interior light. He continued walking, completing another slow circuit. The repetition did not feel tiring, it felt grounding. As he walked, he became aware again of the snow pressing against the building from the outside. He could not hear it, but he felt its presence in the way the world beyond the walls seemed sealed off. The factory felt like a contained space, separate from whatever lay beyond the white. He stopped near a closed office door and rested his forehead lightly against the wood, just for a moment. The door was cool, solid. He straightened again and continued walking without thinking further about it. The heating system cycled once more, a gentle shift in pressure that moved through the vents like a sigh. He paused instinctively, waiting for it to settle. When it did, the silence returned, complete and unbroken. He passed through the main floor again, the covered machines forming familiar shapes along his path. The tarps lay flat now, unmoving. He did not touch them. There was no reason to. At the far end of the floor, he reached a small break area that had once been used more frequently. A table sat against the wall, its surface bare. A vending machine stood dark and silent in the corner, unplugged long ago. He glanced at it briefly and moved on. His route brought him back toward the desk, but he did not stop there yet. Instead, he turned into the storage wing again, walking slowly between empty shelves. Dust rested undisturbed on every surface. The flashlight remained off. He did not need it. He reached the end of the aisle and stopped. The quiet felt thicker here, more enclosed. He stood still, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes open and unfocused. His breathing remained steady. The moment passed without change. He turned and walked back the way he had come, his footsteps marking the same gentle rhythm as before. Nothing shifted, nothing followed. When he returned to the main floor, he checked his watch again. Time continued its steady movement. He acknowledged it with a small adjustment of his posture and continued on. He walked toward the stairwell once more. The door was cool under his hand. He opened it slightly and looked down. The light below remained unchanged, the steps empty. He closed the door and locked it, pressing once more to be certain. Satisfied, he moved away. The snow outside continued to fall, though more slowly now. Through one of the lower windows, he could see where it had piled up against the building, creating a soft, uneven slope. He watched it for a moment, then turned away. He completed another circuit and finally returned to the desk. This time he sat. The chair made only the faintest sound as he lowered himself into it. He rested his hands on his knees and looked at the window beside the desk. The outside world appeared almost flat now, stripped of depth by snow and darkness. The flakes fell steadily, each one following its own quiet path downward. He did not count them, he simply watched. After a while, he reached for the thermos and poured the last of the coffee into his cup. It was nearly cold now. He drank it slowly anyway, letting the familiar taste linger. When the cup was empty, he set it aside and did not refill it. He opened the logbook and wrote another short entry. The pen moved smoothly. He closed the book and slid it back into its place. He sat quietly for a time.
He shifted his weight slightly where he stood, hands still resting on the edge of the desk. The surface felt smooth and cool beneath his gloves. He remained there for a few more breaths, then lifted the flashlight and stepped away again, returning to the familiar paths without altering his pace. The corridor welcomed him back with the same muted stillness. The lights overhead formed a repeating pattern, each pool of brightness separated by soft shadow. He walked through them one by one, letting the rhythm guide him forward. His footsteps blended into the quiet so completely they barely seemed to exist. He turned into a narrow passage that ran along the interior wall of the building. The air here felt slightly drier. He noticed it without reacting, simply allowing the sensation to pass. His body adjusted on its own. At the end of the passage, he stopped beside a small electrical closet. He checked the door, then checked it again, slower the second time. Secure. He stood there for a moment longer, listening. Nothing followed the sound of his hand leaving the handle. He moved on. The snow outside continued its steady descent. Through the high windows, the light had softened further, as if the night itself had grown tired. The world beyond the glass seemed pressed flat, reduced to quiet layers of white and gray. He walked past the windows without stopping this time. He already knew what he would see. His route carried him back toward the center of the factory, where the space widened and the ceiling rose. He slowed slightly, not out of caution, but out of habit. Open spaces always invited a more deliberate pace. His flashlight remained off, hanging loosely at his side. He passed the support columns one by one, their surfaces cool and unmoving. Each one felt like a marker, though he did not count them. He simply passed them, letting the sequence unfold naturally. Near the far wall, he paused again. The heating system murmured softly above him, then quieted. He waited until it settled fully before moving on. The silence returned, complete. He turned and walked back the way he had come, tracing the same path without deviation. The repetition felt neither dull nor tiring. It felt necessary, like breathing. At one point, he noticed a faint creak from somewhere deep within the building. It was brief, indistinct, likely the result of temperature shifting against old materials. He stopped and listened. Nothing followed. He resumed walking without giving it further attention. The desk came into view again, the lamp's glow unchanged. He did not approach it this time. Instead, he turned away at the last moment and followed the outer wall once more. The windows along this wall were nearly opaque now, snow and frost obscuring any clear view. He slowed near one and wiped a small section clean with his sleeve. The outside world appeared only as a pale blur. He watched it for a moment, then let the condensation return, erasing the detail again. He continued on, footsteps steady. In the storage wing, he walked between the shelves again, though this time he moved closer to them, his shoulder nearly brushing the metal. Dust remained undisturbed. The air smelled faintly of cardboard and age. He reached the end of the aisle and stood still. The quiet here felt heavier, more contained. He remained there for several breaths, eyes open, posture relaxed. Nothing shifted, nothing required his attention. He turned and walked back. When he returned to the main floor, he checked his watch again. Time continued forward without signaling itself. He acknowledged it only by adjusting his jacket slightly and continuing his route. The stairwell door came up again along his path. He placed his hand on it, felt the cool metal, and opened it just enough to look down. The light below still glowed steadily. The steps remained empty. He closed the door and locked it, pressing once more to be sure. Satisfied, he moved on. The snow outside had settled into an even quieter fall now. Through a lower window, he could see where it had nearly reached the midpoint of the glass. The building felt insulated, protected, held apart from the rest of the night. He completed another full circuit and returned to the desk. This time, he sat. The chair accepted him without complaint. He rested his hands on his thighs and looked at the window beside the desk. The lamp cast a warm circle that did not change. The radio remained silent. The clock continued its invisible work.
He sat there for a while, not counting minutes, not anticipating the end of the shift. The stillness did not demand anything from him. It simply existed. Eventually, he stood again. The movement felt expected. He picked up the flashlight and stepped away, returning to the corridors once more. The building felt the same as it had all night, steady, quiet, unchanging. The snowstorm continued outside, slow and patient. Inside, the watchman continued his work, moving through the night without interruption, one measured step following another, carrying the calm forward as the hours passed gently.
He moved down the corridor once more, the flashlight swinging lightly in his hand, though he kept the beam low. The familiar rhythm of the space welcomed him, unchanged. Each step was deliberate, steady, its sound absorbed almost entirely by the surrounding quiet. The walls, the floors, the ceilings all seemed to hold their place in patient waiting. He passed a set of doors that led to the storage wing and paused briefly, listening. Nothing shifted. The building made no sound except for the low hum of the heating system somewhere above, a constant breath that reminded him the factory was still alive, if only in a minimal sense. Satisfied, he moved on. Along the main floor, he approached the row of covered machines again. The tarps remained flat, untouched by his earlier passing. He let his flashlight trace the edges briefly, more out of habit than need. The shapes beneath the covers were familiar, predictable. He could imagine their outlines in the dark just as well as under the light. At a corner window, he stopped again. Snow pressed against the glass now, thick enough that the outside world appeared flattened, stripped of all detail. The fence, the road beyond it, the empty lots, they were all softened into indistinct shapes. He rested his forehead lightly against the cool surface, breathing evenly. The sensation grounded him, even in the stillness. He stepped back and continued down the corridor, passing the narrow office doors that led to long, unused workspaces. Each handle was checked, each door gently pressed to ensure it remained locked. Secure, secure, secure. The repetition brought a sense of order, a gentle cadence to the night. At the far end, a small window looked out toward the northeast side of the building. The snow had accumulated unevenly here, forming small drifts that pressed against the glass. He watched a flake detach and slide slowly downward, breaking apart as it fell. The motion was simple, unhurried, and almost hypnotic. He turned away, letting the condensation return to its full coverage, blurring the view once more. He moved into a narrower passage that connected to the older section of the factory. The floor here dipped slightly in places, worn from years of use. His boots adjusted automatically, pressing evenly against the surface. The walls were rougher, the paint faded and chipped. He traced the passage with his eyes and allowed the space to envelop him. The heating system hummed again, a low, steady sound. He paused to let it settle fully. Once it did, he continued. At the end of the passage, he reached another stairwell door. His gloved hand rested on the metal handle, cool to the touch. He opened it just enough to peer down the steps, illuminated by a single dim bulb halfway down. The stairs were empty, no movement, no sound. He closed the door and pressed once more to ensure the latch had caught. Satisfied, he returned to the main floor, walking along the perimeter. The windows along this wall were now nearly opaque, snow and frost completely obscuring the view. He stopped and wiped a small circle on one, just enough to see the outside blur. Snow piled high against the wall, softening the edges, smoothing the contours. He did not linger long. The movement of the flakes was slow, methodical, calming in its predictability. He continued his circuit, returning to the center of the room. Here the ceiling rose high above him, and the space felt open, almost cavernous. He slowed, letting his steps match the quiet rhythm of the room.
The air was still, the shadows were steady, the tarps remained unmoved over the old machines. He walked past the covered machines, deliberately avoiding unnecessary contact. The fabric was heavy, stiff from dust and age. He did not need to adjust it. It lay in perfect stillness. At the break area, he paused briefly. The table was bare, the vending machine dark and unplugged. He glanced around the small space, noting nothing had changed. He moved on. His route took him past the utility panel once more. He checked the indicator lights, steady green, all unchanged. He did not touch it. Habit alone brought him to pause here briefly. In the storage wing, he walked between the shelves again, slow and deliberate. Dust rested on every surface. Cardboard boxes remained stacked neatly. The air smelled faintly of paper, dust, and age. He reached the end of the aisle and stopped, standing still for a few measured breaths. The quiet seemed heavier here, more concentrated, but not uncomfortable. He turned and walked back, completing the aisle once more. The floor beneath his boots was worn smooth in familiar patterns. His steps blended into the silence around him. Back on the main floor, he checked his watch. Time moved steadily forward. He adjusted his jacket, not for warmth, but for comfort, and continued his route. The stairwell door came up again. He placed his hand on the handle, felt the cold metal, and opened it just enough to peer down. The light glowed faintly. The steps were empty. He closed the door and pressed to ensure the latch had caught. Satisfied, he returned to the main floor, walking along the perimeter. The windows along this wall were now nearly opaque, snow and frost completely obscuring the view. He stopped and wiped a small circle on one, just enough to see the outside blur. Snow piled high against the wall, softening the edges, smoothing the contours. He did not linger long. The movement of the flakes was slow, methodical, calming in its predictability. He continued his circuit, returning to the center of the room. Here the ceiling rose high above him, and the space felt open, almost cavernous. He slowed, letting his steps match the quiet rhythm of the room. The air was still. The shadows were steady. The tarps remained unmoved over the old machines. He walked past the covered machines, deliberately avoiding unnecessary contact. The fabric was heavy, stiff from dust and age. He did not need to adjust it. It lay in perfect stillness. At the break area, he paused briefly. The table was bare, the vending machine dark and unplugged. He glanced around the small space, noting nothing had changed. He moved on. His route took him past the utility panel once more. He checked the indicator lights, steady green, all unchanged. He did not touch it. Habit alone brought him to pause here briefly. In the storage wing, he walked between the shelves again, slow and deliberate. Dust rested on every surface. Cardboard boxes remained stacked neatly. The air smelled faintly of paper, dust, and age. He reached the end of the aisle and stopped, standing still for a few measured breaths. The quiet seemed heavier here, more concentrated, but not uncomfortable. He turned and walked back, completing the aisle once more. The floor beneath his boots was worn smooth in familiar patterns. His steps blended into the silence around him. Back on the main floor, he checked his watch. Time moved steadily forward. He adjusted his jacket, not for warmth, but for comfort, and continued his route. The stairwell door came up again. He placed his hand on the handle, felt the cold metal, and opened it just enough to peer down. The light glowed faintly. The steps were empty. He closed the door and pressed to ensure the latch had caught. Satisfied, he returned to the main floor, walking along the perimeter. The windows along this wall were now nearly opaque, snow and frost completely obscuring the view. He stopped and wiped a small circle on one, just enough to see the outside blur. Snow piled high against the wall, softening the edges, smoothing the contours. He did not linger long. The movement of the flakes was slow, methodical, calming in its predictability. He continued his circuit, returning to the center of the room. Here the ceiling rose high above him, and the space felt open, almost cavernous. He slowed, letting his steps match the quiet rhythm of the room. The air was still, the shadows were steady, the tarps remained unmoved over the old machines. He walked past the covered machines, deliberately avoiding unnecessary contact. The fabric was heavy, stiff from dust and age. He did not need to adjust it. It lay in perfect stillness. At the break area, he paused briefly. The table was bare, the vending machine dark and unplugged. He glanced around the small space, noting nothing had changed. He moved on. His route took him past the utility panel once more. He checked the indicator lights, steady green, all unchanged. He did not touch it. Habit alone brought him to pause here briefly. In the storage wing, he walked between the shelves again, slow and deliberate. Dust rested on every surface. Cardboard boxes remained stacked neatly. The air smelled faintly of paper, dust, and age. He reached the end of the aisle and stopped, standing still for a few measured breaths.
He moved down the corridor again, the flashlight swinging loosely in his hand, beam low and unobtrusive. The walls rose steadily on either side, painted in muted tones, now dulled further by years of wear. Each step pressed against the floor with the same measured sound as before, soft and deliberate. The space felt unchanging, as if the building itself existed only to be traversed slowly, methodically. He passed the narrower office doors once more, handles smooth from years of use, paint chipped along edges, each one pressed lightly, checked for security. Secure, secure, secure. The repetition gave rhythm to the night. He did not linger. The pattern was familiar, comforting. At a corner window, he paused. Snow clung to the glass, layered thickly, obscuring the world outside. He rested his forehead lightly against the cool surface, breathing evenly. The flurries moved lazily, some clumping together as they slid downward. The outside world existed only as texture now, muted, flattened, abstract. He stepped back, letting the condensation reform, softening the view again. He continued down the hall, moving past corridors he had walked countless times. The heating system hummed quietly above him, cycling with a faint sigh. He paused until it settled fully, allowing the stillness to fill the space around him. At the far end of the corridor, a stairwell door rose in front of him, metal cool beneath his glove, handle solid. He opened it just enough to glance down. A single dim bulb illuminated the steps. Empty, quiet. He closed the door and pressed the latch once more to ensure it held. He turned down a connecting corridor, walls rougher here, paint fading and cracked. The floor shifted slightly underfoot, worn unevenly from decades of use. His boots adjusted automatically. The air carried a faint scent of dust and aged concrete. He did not think about it, simply allowed it to exist. The main floor opened ahead, its higher ceiling casting shadows that stretched toward him. He slowed, letting his steps match the expanse of the room. Covered machines formed familiar shapes, tarps unmoved. He did not touch them. Their stillness was enough. Passing the break area, he glanced briefly at the empty table and dark, unplugged vending machine. Nothing had changed. He did not pause. Back in the storage wing, he walked between shelves again. Dust lay undisturbed, cardboard boxes stacked neatly. The air smelled faintly of paper and age. At the aisle's end, he stopped for several breaths, feeling the weight of the stillness pressing gently around him.
Turning, he retraced his steps along the same aisle. Floor worn smooth, footsteps quiet, blending into the enveloping silence. On the main floor again, he checked his watch. Time advanced. He acknowledged it by straightening his jacket slightly and moving forward. The stairwell door approached once more. Hand on the cold metal, he opened it slightly, peered down. Light glowed faintly, steps empty. He closed it, pressed the lock, moved on. He passed the outer wall windows, snow piled unevenly, nearly reaching the midpoint of each pane. Shapes outside were blurred, flattened into muted layers of white and gray. He did not linger. Back at the center of the floor, lamps cast gentle circles of light. He slowed, letting his pace match the quiet rhythm. Shadows stayed steady, tarps remained unmoved. At the desk, he rested hands on the surface, looking out the window. The snowflakes fell steadily, each one tracing its own slow, deliberate path. The world beyond seemed abstract, flattened into muted layers. He stood, picked up the flashlight, and stepped away. Corridors accepted him without change. A support column appeared ahead, metal cool beneath his hand. He rested there for several breaths, unmoving, allowing the quiet to settle. He continued his route, through familiar corridors. Every door, every window, every shadow remained as it had been. No surprises, no interruptions. Another full circuit brought him back to the desk. This time he sat, hands resting on his thighs. Lamp glow steady, radio silent, clock unchanging. He sat, breathing evenly, not counting minutes, not anticipating the shift's end. The night demanded nothing. It simply existed. Eventually he stood, motion natural. He picked up the flashlight, stepped away, returned once more to the corridors. The building remained unchanged, steady, patient. Outside, the snowstorm continued its quiet, deliberate work. Inside, the watchman maintained his rhythm, step by step, lock by lock, breath by breath. Calm carried forward, unbroken, infinite in gentle repetition. He passed the narrower office doors again, handles smooth from years of touch, paint chipped along the edges. Secure, secure, secure. Each press of his hand confirmed the stillness, reinforcing the rhythm of the night. He moved past a corner window, snow pressed against the glass, piled thickly. He pressed his forehead lightly against it again, feeling the cold, feeling the quiet. The flakes slid slowly down, breaking apart and melting into the larger mass. He stepped back, letting the condensation soften the glass again. The heating system sighed overhead. He paused for the hum to settle, absorbing it into the silence around him. He reached the stairwell door, metal cool, handle solid, opened just enough to glance down the dimly lit steps. Empty, silent. He closed it, pressed the lock, moved on. Along a connecting corridor, walls rough, floor uneven, boots adjusting automatically. Air smelled faintly of dust, concrete. He did not acknowledge it. The main floor opened, high ceiling, shadows stretching. He slowed, steps measured. Covered machines formed familiar shapes, tarps unmoved. He did not touch them. Their stillness was enough. Passing the break area, he glanced briefly at the empty table and dark, unplugged vending machine. Nothing had changed. He did not pause. Back in the storage wing, he walked between shelves again. Dust lay undisturbed, cardboard boxes stacked neatly. The air smelled faintly of paper and age. At the aisle's end, he stopped for several breaths, feeling the weight of the stillness pressing gently around him. Turning, he retraced his steps along the same aisle.
floor worn smooth, footsteps quiet, blending into the enveloping silence. On the main floor again, he checked his watch. Time advanced.
He followed the corridor again, but this time he let his hand trail lightly along the wall. The surface was cool, faintly textured beneath the fabric of his glove. The sensation grounded him, a quiet confirmation that everything remained as it should be. The corridor bent gently to the left, guiding him toward the loading area. The space opened gradually, not abruptly, as if the building itself preferred transitions to be slow. The large doors at the far end stood closed, their metal frames faintly outlined by the overhead lights. Snow pressed against them from the outside, packed thinly into the seams. He stopped several meters away and listened. The storm made no sound from here. Whatever noise it carried was absorbed by layers of insulation and distance. Inside, there was only the low hum of electricity moving through the building, a sound so constant it barely registered. He walked closer to the doors and inspected the locking bars. They were cold to the touch, solid, unmoved. He tested one gently, then another. No give. He nodded once, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, and stepped back. To the right of the loading area was a small alcove where a bench had been bolted to the wall years ago. He sat there briefly, resting the flashlight across his knees. The bench was hard, unforgiving, but familiar. He had sat there many times before, always for short stretches, never long enough to lose awareness of the space around him. From here, he could see most of the loading floor. Nothing shifted, nothing waited. The stillness lay evenly across the concrete like a second skin. He stood again and moved on. His path carried him past a series of closed offices. The doors were identical, each with a small frosted window. He paused at one and peered through. The room beyond was dim, desks arranged neatly, papers stacked where they had been left weeks ago. He did not enter. He never did. He continued down the line, glancing briefly into each room without slowing his pace. All were the same. All were quiet. At the end of the hallway, he turned and headed back toward the central floor. His steps echoed faintly now, not louder, just clearer. The sound followed him for a moment, then faded as the acoustics changed again. The warmth of the building seemed to fluctuate slightly as he walked. Subtle shifts he felt more than noticed. Near the outer walls, the air cooled. Toward the center, it warmed again. His body adjusted without thought. He passed beneath a vent where warm air flowed steadily downward. He stopped beneath it and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the heat soak into his shoulders. It was not indulgence, it was maintenance. He reopened his eyes and moved on. The clock on the wall near the main floor caught his attention as he passed. The hands had advanced, though he couldn't have said how much without stopping to study them. He did not stop. Time did not require his supervision. He completed another circuit of the central floor, checking corners, doorways, and the quiet spaces between machines. Each machine stood exactly as it had earlier, large shapes softened by shadow. Their presence felt neutral, neither comforting nor threatening, simply present. Near one of the larger units, he noticed a thin line of condensation along the floor, likely from the temperature difference between the machine housing and the surrounding air. He crouched briefly, inspected it, then stood again. Nothing unusual. He moved on. The snow outside thickened again, though he only noticed it when he reached the windows. The flakes moved diagonally now, pushed by a wind he could not hear. The glass vibrated faintly, so subtly it could have been imagined.
He watched for a few seconds longer than usual, then turned away. As he walked, his thoughts remained unformed, drifting without settling on anything specific. He did not replay memories or anticipate what would come after his shift. The present moment was enough. It filled the space completely. He reached the stairwell again and descended this time, his steps measured and unhurried. The lower level greeted him with the same quiet, the same controlled light. Pipes lined the ceiling, running parallel like long, silent companions. He walked beneath them, listening to the occasional soft tick of metal adjusting to the temperature. Each sound resolved quickly, leaving no echo behind. At the far end of the lower level, he stopped beside a maintenance door. He checked the lock, then leaned slightly closer, listening through the metal. Nothing stirred. He straightened and stepped back. The lower level always felt different, not heavier, not darker, just contained. The ceiling pressed a little closer, the air a little stiller. He did not linger longer than necessary. He climbed the stairs again, emerging onto the main floor with the same steady rhythm. His breathing remained even, his pace unchanged. He returned to the desk and poured himself a small cup of coffee from the thermos. The liquid was warm, slightly bitter. He took a few sips, then set it aside. He did not drink quickly. There was no reason to. The lamp's light seemed softer now, though it had not changed. His eyes adjusted, that was all. He sat for a moment, hands folded loosely, gaze unfocused. Then he stood again. The flashlight felt heavier in his hand this time, not because it weighed more, but because the hours had accumulated quietly in his muscles. He acknowledged the sensation without resisting it, and stepped back into the corridor. The night continued its slow passage. The building remained as it had been, secure, silent, patient. Outside, the snowstorm persisted, blanketing the world in steady white. Inside, the watchman moved through familiar paths, carrying the quiet forward, minute by minute, step by deliberate step, as the long winter night unfolded without interruption.
He adjusted his grip on the flashlight and continued down the corridor, letting the beam remain off. The lights overhead were enough. They always were. The flashlight was not for illumination so much as reassurance, an object with weight and purpose, something to carry. The corridor narrowed slightly, then widened again, its proportions changing just enough to be noticed by someone who walked it often. He noticed. He always did. The changes reminded him where he was without requiring thought. As he walked, the building responded in small ways. A distant pipe sighed. A vent shifted its tone. The sounds were subtle, almost apologetic, as if the structure itself were aware of the quiet and careful not to disturb it. He reached a junction where 3 corridors met. He paused there, standing at the center point, and listened. Each corridor offered the same stillness, the same absence of urgency. He chose the one to his left, not because it needed attention more than the others, but because that was the order he followed tonight. The air grew cooler as he moved farther from the core of the building. He zipped his jacket a little higher and continued on. His breath remained slow, controlled, barely visible even in the cooler air. At the end of the corridor was a small window set low into the wall. Snow had built up outside it, pressed so close to the glass that the view was reduced to shifting shades of white. He knelt briefly to look through it, resting one knee on the floor. The cold seeped faintly through the concrete. He watched the snow move for a moment. It did not fall so much as slide past, driven sideways by wind. He stood again and brushed his knee with his glove. Behind him, the corridor remained unchanged. He turned back the way he had come, retracing his steps without hurry. His footsteps echoed faintly here, a soft rhythm that faded quickly.
The sound felt contained, absorbed by the walls. As he approached the junction again, he noticed a faint change in the light ahead. Not dimmer, just different. The bulbs there always carried a slightly warmer tone. He passed beneath them and felt the subtle shift on his skin. The next corridor led him toward an area he visited less frequently. Storage rooms, mostly empty now, their contents moved elsewhere long ago. The doors were marked with faded labels, letters worn thin by time. He opened one door and stepped inside. The room was small, the ceiling low. Shelves lined the walls, mostly bare. A few boxes sat stacked neatly in one corner, their surfaces coated with a thin layer of dust. He did not disturb them. He stood in the center of the room and listened. The quiet here felt deeper, more enclosed. The air did not move much. He remained still for several seconds, then turned and left, closing the door carefully behind him. The latch clicked softly. He tested it once. Secure. Back in the corridor, he resumed his pace. The familiarity of the route settled around him again. Each turn came where he expected it. Each light burned steadily. He passed another window and noticed that the snow had risen higher. It now covered nearly the entire pane. Only the faintest suggestion of movement showed near the top. He acknowledged it and moved on. His watch caught the light as he walked. He glanced at it briefly, then looked away. The numbers meant little beyond confirmation that time was still progressing. He reached the central floor once more. The openness greeted him, the ceiling arching above like a held breath. He slowed slightly, scanning the space without focusing on any one point. The machines stood in their places, dark and silent. Their outlines had softened further as the night deepened. Shadows pooled beneath them, unmoving. He walked the perimeter, staying close to the walls. His hand brushed a railing, then left it. The metal was cold, steady. Near the far corner, he noticed a small piece of debris on the floor, a fragment of something brittle, perhaps insulation or old packaging. He crouched, picked it up, and examined it briefly. It crumbled slightly between his fingers. He carried it to a nearby bin and dropped it inside. He wiped his gloves together once and stood. The act felt complete. The space felt restored. He returned to the desk again, not to sit this time, but to adjust the lamp. He shifted it a few inches, changing the angle of light across the surface. The difference was minor, but noticeable to him. He checked the radio, still silent. He stood there for a moment, listening to the building breathe around him. The heating system cycled on and off somewhere above, its presence gentle, unobtrusive. Then he turned away again. The corridor welcomed him back, unchanged. He followed it without deviation, his steps measured, his posture relaxed. The night continued to stretch ahead, unbroken. Outside, the snowstorm persisted, blanketing everything beyond the walls in white. Inside, the watchman continued his steady movement, maintaining the quiet through repetition and presence alone, carrying the long winter night forward, one deliberate step at a time.
He moved past the desk and into the corridor again, the motion so familiar it felt less like a decision and more like a continuation of something already in progress. His body carried the routine forward without instruction. Each step landed where it should. The corridor lights hummed faintly, a sound so constant it faded into the background. He noticed it only when it shifted slightly, the pitch rising for a brief moment before settling again. He slowed just enough to register the change, then continued. He reached a corner where the wall bore a long scuff mark, pale against the darker paint. It had been there for years. He paused beside it, looking at the uneven edges, the way it curved slightly, as if something heavy had brushed past long ago. He did not try to remember what caused it. The mark existed. That was enough. Beyond the corner, the floor sloped gently downward. He adjusted his stride automatically,
compensating for the incline. The air here felt marginally cooler, carrying a faint metallic smell. Pipes ran behind the walls, unseen but present, their paths mapped clearly in his mind. He stopped beside a service panel and checked the indicator lights. All steady, no flicker. He pressed his ear lightly against the metal for a moment, listening past the surface. The sounds inside were muted, orderly. He straightened and moved on. The snow outside had reached the lower edge of one of the taller windows now. He noticed it in passing, the white pressed firmly against the glass, reshaping the outside world into a single continuous surface. There was no sense of depth beyond it, only motion and light. He did not linger. As he walked, the building seemed to respond subtly to his presence, not in any deliberate way, but through small adjustments, air moving, materials expanding and contracting, systems cycling on and off. The place was alive in its own restrained manner, aware of itself, but unconcerned. He reached another junction and chose the corridor straight ahead. This one was longer, more uniform, its walls uninterrupted by doors for a considerable distance. His footsteps echoed here, not loudly, but clearly, each one arriving and departing with equal precision. Halfway down, he stopped. The pause was instinctive. There was no sound that demanded it, no movement that required attention. Still, he stood there, listening. The corridor offered nothing unusual. The echo of his last step had already faded. He resumed walking. At the far end, he found a small maintenance cart parked neatly against the wall. He checked it briefly, ensuring the tools were secured, the wheels locked. Everything was as it should be. He placed his hand on the handle for a moment, then stepped away. The return walk felt slightly different, though nothing had changed. Perhaps it was the accumulation of time, or the way fatigue settled quietly rather than announcing itself. His shoulders felt heavier, but his pace remained steady. When he reached the central floor again, he crossed it diagonally this time, altering his usual path just enough to register the difference. The space accepted the change without resistance. The lights above remained constant. He passed close to one of the larger machines and rested his hand briefly against its side. The metal was cool, unmoving. He withdrew his hand and continued. Near the far wall, he noticed the faintest vibration through the floor, likely from the heating system adjusting to the cold outside. The sensation passed quickly, leaving the concrete solid and inert again. He checked his watch once more. The hands had moved, marking time without comment. He adjusted his jacket collar and carried on. The stairwell door appeared again, familiar and unremarkable. He opened it and looked down. The light was unchanged. He did not descend this time. He closed the door softly and secured it. Back in the corridor, he slowed slightly, letting his breathing settle into a deeper rhythm. The night felt long, but not endless. There was comfort in its continuity. He returned to the desk and sat, lowering himself carefully into the chair. The lamp cast its steady circle. He rested his forearms on the desk and looked at the surface, noting small scratches, tiny imperfections that told quiet stories of use. He took another sip of coffee. It had cooled, but remained drinkable. He did not mind. For a while, he remained seated, listening to the building's low, steady sounds. The silence between them felt full rather than empty, as if it held the weight of all the hours passing unnoticed. Eventually, he stood again. The chair made a faint sound as he pushed it back into place. He picked up the flashlight and stepped away from the desk, returning once more to the corridors. Outside, the snowstorm continued its patient work, covering everything without pause. Inside, the watchman moved through the same measured paths, maintaining the quiet not through effort, but through presence alone, as the winter night carried on, unbroken and calm.